The Falklands War raged between Argentina and the UK over the course of 10 weeks in 1982, with the conflict being part of a larger dispute over the sovereignty of the territories of the Falkland Islands and South Georgia. The difficult battle led to a total of 1,137 casualties for the British, including 107 captured, while the Argentinians suffered 13,619 casualties, including over 11,000 captured. The Falklands War has been the subject of numerous books, films, and even songs over the years, and it is still a controversial conflict to this day. Welcome to Wars of the World. By the time of the war in 1982, the dispute between Argentina and the UK for the sovereignty of the Falklands had been going on for decades. In 1965, the United Nations had called for the two countries to reach an agreement, with the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office willing to relinquish the islands to Argentine control, as the disagreement between the two countries was affecting British trade in South America. However, a settlement was never reached, in part because many islanders who were of British descent would not accept Argentine rule. From an Argentine perspective, the 1982 invasion was not considered an invasion, but rather a reclamation of territory that they believed to be theirs. Back in 1764, France was the first nation to create a colony on East Falkland, while the West Falkland was shortly thereafter claimed by the British. 5 years later, the Spanish took control of the fort at Port Egmont, the British settlement on West Falkland. 5 decades later, an individual working for what is today Argentina, but was then known as the United Provinces of the River Plate, claimed possession of the islands. In 1833, the British asked the Argentines to leave, while reasserting its power and control over the land. The Falklands would remain in possession of the British in the decades which followed, though its claim over the islands was controversial at best. In 1971, the Communications Agreement was signed by representatives of the British and Argentine governments, which saw the Argentines introduce an air link between the Falklands and the city of Buenos Aires in order to establish some sort of presence on the islands. Further talks took place in 1977 at the behest of British Prime Minister James Callaghan, but in the end, little progress was made. In 1979, a general election led the Conservative Party to come into power in the UK. The following year, the new UK Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Nicholas Ridley, visited the Falklands and attempted to sell islanders a leaseback scheme, but they were not impressed and they turned down his offer. Back in London, he was reportedly seen as a sellout, though later that evening he predicted that Argentina would soon invade, stating, quote, "If we don't do something, they will invade, and there is nothing we could do." End quote. Argentina, for its part, was suffering from economic stagnation and political unrest during the late 1970s and early 80s. Between March 1976 and 1981, Jorge Rafael Videla was the country's 42nd president and dictator. He had risen to power following a coup that had overthrown the government of Isabel Perón, and his rule is infamous for its regular abuses of human rights and poor handling of the economy. A new junta, or military dictatorship, was brought in December of 1981, headed by General Leopoldo Galtieri, and it was this oppressive junta which brought about the idea of invading the Falklands. They hoped it would appeal to the Argentine people and bring out feelings of patriotism, uniting them under the government while settling the civil unrest and distracting them from the economic hardships plaguing the country. On March 19, 1982, Argentine Marines infiltrated a group of Argentine scrap metal merchants and raised the Argentina flag on the island of South Georgia, an act which would later be deemed as the first offensive action in the war. The British subsequently dispatched the HMS Endurance to the island, and in the following days, the Argentine junta decided to bring forward the invasion to April 2nd. On April 1st, 1982, the Argentine junta launched Operation Rosario, in which they deployed ships from their navy containing equipment, weapons, and vehicles to the shores of the Falkland Islands. That night, Argentine Rear Admiral Jorge Alara radioed the island's governor, Rex Hunt, requesting a peaceful surrender. But Hunt refused the offer, and so several groups, including the 1st Marine Infantry Battalion, led by Lieutenant Commander Pedro Giacchino, moved towards Moody Brook Barracks near Stanley, the capital city of the Falkland Islands. The Argentines believed that the barracks contained sleeping British Royal Marines, although nobody appeared to be on guard, and the area was quiet. Lieutenant Commander Guillermo Sanchez Sabarot, leading the 1st Amphibious Commandos Group, later recalled, quote, "It was still completely dark. We were going to use tear gas to force the British out of the buildings and to capture them. Our orders were not to cause casualties if possible. That was the most difficult mission of my career. All our training as commandos was to fight aggressively and inflict maximum casualties on the enemy. We surrounded the barracks with machine gun teams, leaving only one escape route along the peninsula north of Stanley Harbour. Anyone who did not get away would not be able to reach the town and reinforce the British there. Then we threw the gas grenades into each building. There was no reaction. The barracks were empty." End quote. The noise of the grenades, however, alerted the British to the presence of the Argentines on the island. Major Mike Norman, in overall command of the British Marines, ordered all 68 troops to move to the government house and take up defensive positions. The Falkland Islands Defence Force, made up of around 23 men, whose duties mostly consisted of keeping a lookout, also received such orders and were advised not to engage with the enemy. It was later reported that though there were no eyewitness accounts of the Argentine attack on the barracks, the state that the building had been left in told a different version of events to that of the Argentine narrative. British troops described the walls of the building as having been riddled with bullets and covered in marks of white phosphorus grenades, which was described as a classic house-clearing operation. Lieutenant Commander Pedro Giacchino had a group of just 16 men, but was determined to capture the government house, a building that was considered strategically important. He split his men into smaller teams, placing them at the side of the building and at the rear, believing that there were no British troops to fight, and that the task wouldn't be particularly difficult. The first attack against the government building came at 6:30 AM, shortly before more Argentine troops landed at York Bay. Lieutenant Gustavo Lugo led one of the units and started firing on the British Marines inside the residence. Meanwhile, Giacchino, along with another small unit, entered the servants' annex, mistakenly believing it to be the rear entrance of the building. 4 British Marines, however, fended off this attack, with Giacchino being hit in the process, while another Argentine lieutenant was shot in the arm. Giacchino was alive, but badly hurt, and while an Argentine medic attempted to get to him, they were stopped and wounded during a grenade attack. Giacchino, upset by this, pulled the pin on one of his own grenades and threatened to use it. The British attempted to persuade him to get rid of the grenade so that they could treat him themselves, but Giacchino refused, and thus the British were unable to move towards him for fear of him releasing the weapon. He would later be taken to a hospital, but ultimately too late, and he died from a loss of blood. Meanwhile, over the eastern edge of the city of Stanley, 20 AAVs, assault amphibious vehicles, were dispatched from Puerto Belgrano, along with 2 companies of the 2nd Marine Infantry Battalion, and arriving via York Bay. On the morning of April 2nd, they were engaged by a section of British Marines armed with anti-tank rockets and machine guns as they made their way along the airport road towards Stanley. Governor Rex Hunt, in his memoir, recalled that a direct hit brought the leading Argentine Amtrak to a halt, writing, quote, About this time, we received the heartening news that the section led by Mike's second-in-command, Bill Trollope, had knocked out the 1st APC. They put an 84mm rocket into the tracks, and a 66mm rocket into the passenger compartment. They stood ready to shoot anyone who got out, but nobody did." End quote. The British subsequently withdrew along Davis Street, while the Argentine Marines pursued them through the residential area. The British had hoped to reach Government House, but were struggling to do so. According to The Falklands War, The Full Story, by the Sunday Times Insight Team, quote, "The Marines, now numbering 16, decided to try and work their way around to the back of the ridge where the Argentinians were positioned, and then charge down to Government House, hopefully taking the enemy by surprise. But as they moved through the edges of the town, they came under fire at every street corner, and it was eventually so heavy they had to abandon their plans." End quote. However, Corporal Lou Armour was not dissuaded and decided to try once more to reach Government House, leading his men across a football pitch before crawling beneath the hedgerow in the gardens around the building. He later stated, quote, "I had a running battle with a bunch of Argentines in armoured vehicles who were chasing me and my section back towards Stanley. When we eventually got to Government House, we were taking fire from 3 directions. The Argentines who were attacking the house, both behind and in front, and our own guys, who were in the house and thought we were another Argentine snatch squad trying to get in. So that was a bit hairy. An Argentine was killed that day, and a few more wounded." End quote. The British troops had at last made it inside Government House. Over by Stanley Harbour, however, more Argentine troops and vehicles were coming, and further British Marines attempted to fend them off, with one firing an anti-tank round into the side of a personnel landing craft, which the British claimed killed all on board. Back inside Government House, things were looking dire for the British, as they mistakenly believed that there were more Argentine troops than there actually were. The Argentine stun grenades were believed to have been high-explosive rifle grenades, and their tactic of constantly moving also contributed to this inaccurate belief. In reality, only around a dozen men surrounded the house. Governor Rex Hunt in a phone call stated, quote, "We're staying put here, but we are pinned down. We can't move. They must have 200 around us now. They've been throwing rifle grenades at us. I think there may be mortars, I don't know. They came along very quickly and very close, and then they retreated. Maybe they're waiting until the APCs come along, and they think they'll lose less casualties that way." End quote. Outside, 2 snipers picked off Argentine troops as they tried to spread out across the hillside which overlooked the building. At around 7:30 AM, the local police became involved when it was discovered that a civilian had gone to work at the Government House, unaware of the violence going on. About an hour later, Hunt decided to reach out to Argentine commanders in search of a solution, as he had been warned by Major Norman that, quote, "Our defense would be determined, unrelenting, but would be relatively short-lived." End quote. The Argentine liaison was Hector Gilabert, the head of the Argentine government's airline, LADE. Gilabert, along with the governor's deputy, displayed a white flag after heading to the Argentine headquarters, and a temporary ceasefire was implemented. The Argentine commander subsequently agreed to a face-to-face meeting with Hunt inside his office, and despite being advised that he and the Royal Marines could break out into the countryside and set up government elsewhere, Hunt relented, agreeing to surrender to Vice Admiral Carlos Busa and the Argentine forces at around 9:30 AM. Hunt later recalled in his memoir, quote, "With a heavy heart, I turned to Mike and told him to give the order to lay down arms. I could not bring myself to use the word surrender." Mike's face was a mixture of relief and anguish. It was not part of his training to surrender, but his good sense told him that there was no real alternative. End quote. He believed that the British were at a tactical disadvantage and were greatly outnumbered, and went to Stanley Hall, the headquarters of the Argentine commanders, wearing his full dress uniform. Reportedly, in a final act of defiance, he told Busa, quote, "You have landed unlawfully on British territory, and I order you to remove yourself and your troops forthwith." End quote. Busser responded by laughing. Hunt was then roughed up and his medals stolen before he was placed in confinement. Several hours later, he was flown to Montevideo, Uruguay. He was later returned to England, where he spent the war living in London. On April 3rd, the UN Security Council called for an end to hostilities and demanded that Argentine troops withdraw. But their demands went unheeded, and on April 6th, the British government established a war cabinet which would oversee day-to-day operations of the campaign. In the following days, the US Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, was sent by President Ronald Reagan to try and broker a solution between the two nations. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher bluntly told Haig that their task force would only be withdrawn if the Argentine government withdrew its troops first. However, the Argentine commanders were just as immovable, stating that sovereignty was a non-negotiable component, and that no talks would be had without it. When Haig returned to London on April 11th, he found that the British government had no interest in a compromise. He subsequently returned to the US before heading to South America once more, but little progress was made, and on April 30th, the US government announced that it was publicly supporting the UK. The British task force dispatched to the Falkland Islands was comprised of 127 ships, as well as 2 aircraft carriers, the submarine the HMS Conqueror, and 2 ocean liners carrying the 3rd Commando and 5th Infantry Brigades. Additionally, the Royal Air Force set up an airbase on Ascension Island, another British overseas territory, equipped with refueling aircraft, bombers, and fighter aircraft. In mid-April, a British naval task force was sent to the island to prepare, while another was dispatched to South Georgia to reclaim the territory. Operation Parakeet was the name given to the operation to recapture South Georgia and involved Marines from 42 Commando, a unit of the Special Air Service, and a reconnaissance team made up of members of the Special Boat Service. All in all, 240 troops were part of the operation, commanded by Major Guy Sheridan. The HMS Conqueror was the first to arrive in the Falklands on April 19th, and 2 days later, SAS and SBS troops began to land on the outskirts of South Georgia, but their mission to establish an observation post was soon halted when 2 helicopters crashed due to difficult weather conditions. On April 24th, the British regrouped to begin their mission afresh, but the next day, an Argentine submarine, the ARA Santa Fe, was spotted on the surface by a British helicopter, leading many British ships to dispatch aircraft to attack the submarine. The Santa Fe was ultimately so severely damaged that it was unable to dive, and so the crew had to abandon her. Major Sheridan subsequently gathered the 76 men he had available and went to confront the Argentine forces on the island. Aided by a demonstration by 2 Royal Navy ships, the British watched as the 190 Argentine troops surrendered without any resistance. South Georgia was back in the hands of the British. On April 30th, the British government imposed a 200-mile total exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands, banning all air and watercraft from entering the area, no matter what nation they were from. British Special Forces, Royal Air Force, and Fleet Air Arm all participated in attacking Argentine ships and defences within the zone. On May 1st, British Admiral Sandy Woodward and his fleet, consisting of 12 warships and 3 supply ships, entered the zone with the intention of destroying Argentine air and sea forces before a series of long-range bombing missions. This was known as Operation Black Book. Believing that the British would likely take this course of action, Admiral Jorge Anaya deployed his own available warships, including the ARA General Belgrano, a vintage World War II era light cruiser, which was accompanied by 2 modern-day destroyer ships. That same day, the HMS Conqueror followed the Belgrano group, and the next day it arrived just outside the total exclusion zone. Woodward believed that he might be caught in a pincer movement, and so he ordered that the General Belgrano be attacked. Unbeknownst to him, the other ship he'd been aware of had been unable to launch its aircraft. The War Cabinet back in London gave Woodward's assault the go-ahead, and the General Belgrano was subsequently hit by 2 torpedoes, killing 321 crew members and 2 civilians. The ship sank an hour later, and over 700 people were rescued the following day, having been floating in harsh sea conditions for up to 30 hours. The sinking of the General Belgrano is still one of the most contentious actions throughout the entire Falklands War, with some European countries wavering in their support for the British in the aftermath. Furthermore, it greatly upset those in Latin America, including Argentina itself, with critics observing that the ship was not in the exclusion zone, and that the British assault had been a particularly reckless one. Notorious British tabloid The Sun ran the headline, "Gotcha," when featuring the news on its front page. Still, many argued that the sinking of the ship had been necessary and provided great leverage to the British, as once the action was carried out, the vast majority of the Argentine fleet returned to port and did not emerge again during the war, meaning that the Argentine naval threat had been completely removed. The ship's captain, Hector Bonzo, had survived the attack, and in 2003 he had told the documentary crew that he had been moving towards the exclusion zone, not away from it, and that he was under orders to attack any British ships that he came across. This at least put to rest the speculation that the General Belgrano had been heading back to port at the time of its destruction, and in fact that the reverse was likely true. 2 days after the sinking of General Belgrano, the British HMS Sheffield was subject to a missile strike from Argentine forces, killing 20 crew members and injuring 24 more. The ship was subsequently abandoned, but kept afloat in the hopes that it would draw the attention of Argentine submarines searching for targets, which in turn would allow the British to target those submarines. The ship ultimately sank on May 10th, while being towed to Ascension Island. In the previous weeks of conflict, the Argentines lost around 20 to 30% of their aircraft, something that became obvious when they realized that they were unable to adequately prevent the British from landing on the islands. Believing that a ground assault would come first and swiftly, the ground forces commander, General Mario Menendez, centralized many of his troops around the city of Stanley in order to protect the airstrip. Instead, the British decided to land initially near Port San Carlos, on the northern coast of East Falkland, hoping to avoid casualties to the civilians as well as the troops. The British began landing on May 21st, and by dawn the following day they had established an area from which they could conduct their operations. The first and longest battle in the war was the Battle of Goose Green, which began on May 28th, a week after the British had landed. The hamlet of Goose Green was one of several key positions on the Falklands Islands which would need to be captured for strategic purposes, but it was somewhat of a controversial move. The commander of the British Land Forces, Brigadier Julian Thompson, was under pressure to produce quick results by the government, and he believed that getting bogged down in these smaller disputes would interfere with their plans to confront Argentine leadership in Stanley. Military advisors also stated that ignoring Goose Green could lead to a better outcome for British troops by avoiding death and injury. But still, despite all of this, the decision was made to recapture the hamlet, defended by Argentine Lieutenant Colonel Italo Piaggi and his 1,200 men, who were well entrenched and well equipped with mortars and artillery support. Meanwhile, the British team 2 Para was sent in to capture the hamlet, and was made up of around half as many troops. British leaders were confident, however, in the abilities and experience of their men, and believed that the element of surprise would help them to win the battle. As well as being outnumbered, the British were also aware that the battlefield would make things difficult for them, not because of tricky terrain, but rather a lack of it. It was mostly made up of green, flat fields, with no trees and little vegetation, as well as peat bogs. Concealment was virtually impossible, and the weather was mostly wet and windy as the troops engaged in battle. Both sides declined to attack at night, so as not to risk harming the civilians. On the night of May 27th, British troops moved towards the hamlet, avoiding making noise so that they could avoid detection. They planned to strike at first light. However, they soon discovered that the Argentine soldiers had been expecting them, and as a result, they'd reinforced their defences. Although British troops were halted twice during their advances, it only cost them around 3 hours, and no lives were immediately lost. A Company, however, was delayed by another hour as they moved to the bottom of Darwin Hill and came face to face with entrenched Argentines. The British were subsequently pinned down amongst gunfire, and Company B decided to withdraw from their position, which offered no protection. The two units then sought out defensive positions, while the 2 Para commander, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones, attempted to charge up a small gully to take control of the situation and to spin the advantage back to the British. But all this movement served to do was to kill 3 men who followed behind him. Jones himself was shortly afterwards injured by gunfire and died within minutes. He would later be posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. For the next 5 hours, more fighting ensued between the two sides, and ammunition was running low for the British. A Company eventually managed to overpower the defenders on Darwin Hill, securing the area after just 1 o'clock that afternoon. They next moved on towards Boca Hill, where the Argentine defenders surrendered, but the operation was not yet complete. The battle for Goose Green would take 40 hours and see the loss of 17 British and 47 Argentine troops, including Sergeant Sergio Ishmael Garcia, who single-handedly covered his men as they withdrew into the Darwin Goose Green track in order to escape. He was posthumously awarded the Argentine Nation to the Valor in Combat Medal. At one point, Argentine reinforcements were deployed, but heavy artillery fire by the British forced them to flee the area, with some escaping on the very helicopter that had recently dropped them into position. Major Keeble, now in command of 2 Para following the death of Lieutenant Colonel Jones, and his men had now surrounded the Argentine position, though it had not yet been captured. With his men low on supplies, he wondered if the Argentine troops would simply surrender with the knowledge that there was nowhere left for them to go. Though he had made a backup plan, which involved calling in helicopters and other firepower in case the opposition didn't surrender, in the end, Keeble never had to use it. On the morning of May 29th, Argentine forces in Goose Green formally surrendered and were taken prisoner. Another important area to be seized by the British was Mount Kent, a hill on East Falkland about 5 miles west of Stanley. Brigadier Julian Thompson later wrote that the absence of British troops on the mountain would lead the Argentine patrols to attack vulnerable aircraft and troops, noting that such guards would, quote, have had a turkey shoot on the vulnerable helicopters and troops as they jumped out, temporarily disorientated in the darkness. The operation would have been a disaster. End quote. On the night of May 29th to the 30th, Argentine commander André Ferrero and his men came across a British SAS unit on the slope of the hill. The subsequent engagement led to the severe injury of 1 Argentine troop and the abandonment of numerous pieces of equipment. 2 SAS troops were also wounded in the skirmish, but the unit secured the hill and established a presence. Royal Marine reinforcements and the 7th Sphinx Battery of the 29th Commando Regiment Royal Artillery were both sent in helicopters to keep Mount Kent secure, but upon arriving at their landing site, they discovered the flashes of gun and artillery fire lighting up the night. They soon discovered that another battle was happening, involving the SAS troops who had already established a presence hours earlier. They'd spotted movement from the Argentines attempting to leave the area. The short-lived conflict on Mount Kent resulted in a British win, with the SAS securing the hill by the following day. On June 1st, 5,000 more British troops arrived, as did a new commander, Major General Jeremy Moore. This led the British to begin devising a plan to attack Argentine forces in Stanley. While they planned, their naval forces continued to face injury and even destruction at the hands of Argentina's limited but effective air assaults, killing 56 men and injuring 150 when they attacked the RFA Sir Galahad and RFA Sir Tristram on June 8th. on the night of June 11th, after days of reconnaissance and strategy planning, the British launched an assault on the high ground surrounding the city of Stanley, which was heavily defended by Argentines. While the Navy provided gunfire, ground troops from the 3 Commando Brigade went on to capture Mounts Longdon, Harriet, and Two Sisters Mountain, thus scuppering Argentine plans to reclaim the various high points around the island. The Battle of Mount Harriet led to the deaths of 2 British and 18 Argentine soldiers, while the conflict at Mount Longdon was perhaps the most difficult, as British troops had to persevere through rifle, mortar, artillery, and sniper fire. During this fight, 14 died when the HMS Glamorgan was struck by a French anti-ship missile, which had been taken by Argentine naval technicians. Trevor Bradshaw, who'd participated in the Battle of Mount Longdon as part of Para 3, recalled, quote, "It was mayhem, with friendly and enemy artillery fire dropping all over the place." End quote. The two sides engaged in brutal fighting throughout the night, and suffered severe losses as a result. But despite the difficulties, the British emerged victorious. On June 13th, the next phase of the plan was put into action, when 2 Para, aided by the Blues and Royals Cavalry Regiment, took control of Wireless Ridge at the cost of 3 British and 25 Argentine lives. Members of the Scots Guards also secured Mount Tumbledown, in which 10 British troops and 30 Argentine troops were killed. Again though, the British had succeeded, and now that defences around the outside of Stanley had crumbled, the Argentine resistance within the city had also started to falter. Over on Mount William, a unit of Gurkhas arrived, having been delayed the night before, to discover that Argentine posts had been abandoned. The following day, on June 14th, a ceasefire was declared, and that night, Margaret Thatcher announced to the House of Commons that negotiations pertaining to the surrender of Argentine troops were underway. Throughout much of the war, peace attempts were made, but they were always fruitless. The Argentines rejected what the British proposed, and vice versa. The UN Secretary, on May 18th, then proposed that a UN administrator should supervise the mutual withdrawal of both troops. Then both countries could attempt to reach some kind of settlement and govern the islands with the help of representative institutions of the islands. Eventually, the British suggested that future negotiations about the island sovereignty be carried out by the UN, but the Argentines rejected this notion. In the weeks following the Falklands War, the British retook the South Sandwich Islands. Though the battle was now over, it was not without its cost. The British had lost 255 lives, while a further 775 troops were wounded, and 107 were captured by the Argentines. They also lost numerous ships, including 2 destroyers and a container ship, 24 helicopters, and 10 aircraft. Furthermore, 3 civilians had lost their lives during shelling on the island. However, the losses of the Argentines were much greater. 649 people were killed, 1,657 were wounded, and over 11,300 were captured, though they were freed following the end of the conflict. They also lost much of their equipment, including 25 helicopters, 1 submarine, and 35 fighter planes. While there is much debate and controversy surrounding the Falklands War, for Margaret Thatcher and her Conservative Party, it served to do nothing but boost their popularity, with some observing that the country's victory was a defining moment of the Prime Minister's term. Furthermore, the Conservative Party won by a landslide at the next general election, the first time it had won in such a manner since 1945. The war itself was heavily supported by the British public, and it lifted morale at a time when many British citizens felt that their country no longer had influence in the world, and that times were tough due to declining industries and economic hardships. Not all the consequences were bad, however. With the failure of the Falklands War under their belt, Argentina's junta government began to buckle, and in 1983, democracy was reinstated with a general election being held on October 30th. Raúl Alfonsín of the Radical Civic Union won the election, and served as the 49th president of Argentina until 1989. Meanwhile, those living on the Falkland Islands had their full British citizenship restored in 1983, and more funding was poured into the area, meaning that civilians enjoyed a better quality of life and a boosted economy. Furthermore, a new constitution came into place in 1985, and again in 2009, which promoted devolved powers to the Falkland citizens. Though the engagement was brief, lasting just 10 weeks, it was a fierce fight. And yet the debate about sovereignty was never really solved. While in 1989, Argentina and Britain re-established their relationship via a joint statement, Argentina still maintains that it has a claim on the islands. In 2013, a referendum saw islanders vote in favour of remaining a British territory, but the Argentine government waved it off as a publicity stunt, and to many, the issue is still unresolved.